So I'm coming into you today from Maryland. I'm actually with the United Workers, one of our organizations that's part of our network at their leadership retreat. And I'm just so grateful to be here. It really feels like home, even though I live in Central Appalachia region of Pennsylvania, and I'm with Put People First PA. So first, I want to just say that this is not a policy webinar. We're not gonna get into nitty-gritty policy details of things that are happening within the state. Just in case, you were wondering, like, well, what are they really going to be talking about? As Jason mentioned earlier, we're talking about something called political economy today. And you heard Willie say that in the Mishtiga, if you heard the Mishtiga, he said political economy. And that's a word I think we don't use enough. We don't always know what it means. And so we just offer this very simple, straightforward definition of really looking at how is wealth created, who creates it, who gets what and why, right? So it's really the kind of looking at the interconnection between the economic system that we live in and then the different kind of manifestations of how that shows up in our lives. Um, and so first I want to give a little bit of grounding in how did we get here before we really get into this question of like, what does the economic crisis look like today? We should talk a little bit. We always try to put in context here in the Nonviolent Medicaid Army. If we're talking about a situation, we have to know how did we get to that situation, right? What are the factors that precipitated us to get to that situation? And so we're going to do a couple things in order to get there. We're going to watch a couple of short videos. And the first one we're going to watch speaks to this question of like, who are we up against and how do they see the world? And I think we don't look at that quite enough. We're really encouraged in this culture, in this society, to look at like other people out there, right, who are saying and doing things, and maybe sometimes they're employed by the people that we're up against, or maybe sometimes they're just consuming the media and the narratives of the people that we're up against, and we're kind of trained to just focus on them constantly, right? What are they saying? What are they doing? But not really looking at what we're up against, right? The system that we're up against and the people who are controlling and really kind of engineering that system. And so we're going to watch a short video from someone named Ian Bremer today. Ian Bremer is a strategist. I would call him a strategist for the ruling class. I'm sure he's a great, human being. I'm not criticizing him as a person. He is just, in fact, a strategist for the ruling class. He has a political risk research and consulting firm. He was just at the World Economic Forum, right, which is a ruling class think tank that meets annually in Davos, Switzerland, and that brings together representatives of capital with politicians and celebrities. So that's a little bit about who made this video. And we're not watching this video from the lens, and this is another thing we learned in the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, right? We're making an analysis. So we're not watching this because we're like, ooh, what does Ian Bremer have to say? Like, let's soak up his wisdom. Like, that isn't why we're watching it. We're watching it to make an analysis of like, how does the ruling class understand what's going on today, right? Because we're experiencing this economic crisis, and there is an economic crisis, but of course, the working class needs to really understand and see that differently from the ruling class. So we're going to start by looking at how does the ruling class see what's happening and what are they thinking about? What are they talking about? What are they trying to manage, right? And so you're going to see in this video Ian Bremer referencing this concept of polycrisis, and then he's going to kind of lay out what that is, keeping in mind that this video is from 2023. So it's a little bit, it's not from this year, but I think it still kind of lays out this picture of like when they have these meetings in Davos, Switzerland, like what are they coming together to talk about, right? The folks who have a controlling interest in the economy, and then the people who kind of enact these policies in government. Like, what are they trying to manage as they look at this world? and the problems that, they have essentially created. So we're going to watch this video, and then we're going to contrast that with our theory of change. So I just want you to pay attention to, like, what are you getting? What are you taking from this video in terms of what they think is the problem and what are they trying to manage? So let's play it.
How would you describe the world in 2023? Getting better, getting worse, hot mess, dumpster fire? Depending on the issue we're discussing, all of those and more could be accurate. But here's one many of you probably haven't heard: polycrisis. Ahead of this gathering in Davos, organizers of the forum wrote, "We've run out of words to describe what's happening in the world today," so they found a new one: polycrisis. It basically means many risks at once, compounding and making everything worse. One publication described it as a tangle of knots spanning the globe that we're all trying to undo. The story goes something like this: the COVID pandemic caused mass economic havoc. And just when the global economy was beginning to rebound, wham! All along comes a war in Ukraine, further disrupting supply chains, driving more people into food insecurity, and creating an energy crisis. Pile on top of that the ongoing climate emergency, mounting cybersecurity threats, and democracy in decline around the world. Polycrisis sounds even too Swiss. Those of you watching who are old enough to remember the 1970s might be thinking, high inflation, climbing oil prices, a looming recession. I have seen this movie before. But in many ways, you haven't. Because in 1979, there were 4.3 billion people on planet Earth. Late last year, on November 15th, the global population hit 8 billion, almost twice as many. Between 1880 and 1980, the Earth's temperature rose by 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit every decade. Between 1980 and now, more than double that. It's literally a different world. So how do we untangle those giant knots? This week, thousands of leaders from all around the globe gathered here in Davos to tackle that question. There's one more question looming over the Alps. Is this the place to find the answer? Only one leader of a G7 nation, Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, was scheduled to attend. In 2018, 6 of the 7 did. But as the cost of living continues to rise, global inequality continues to soar, and human development indicators are moving backwards for 3 years and counting, doubts are growing about the relevance of this elite gathering.
All right. Thank you. So take a breath. All right. So I want to ask for you to consider, and we're not going to come off mute now, but you can put some thoughts in the chat on this. Does this video, right? There's lots of stuff out there like this, right? That's sort of presented from the perspective, and maybe we can just take down the slides for a second. That's presented from the perspective of the ruling class, right? Kind of talking about all of these threats and all of these situations, and with this veneer of, oh, these are serious problems that we need to figure out how to solve. But my question here is, does this video actually help us to make an accurate assessment that is going to assist in our movement to abolish poverty? Right? Does this video like help us to be clearer? Does it help us to get clear? And I would say the reason, I see people saying that it doesn't, and I think that's true. And I want to say that the reason why is because this is presented from the ruling class perspective, which is essentially about managing the manifestations of the problems created by the system without changing the system. And the real question behind what Ian Bremmer is laying out here as this polycrisis is, what are all the threats to increasing our capital, right? Like, what are all the potential threats and issues that could come in the way of our profiteering? Now, he doesn't say that, but that's essentially what's implied, right? How do we manage, a world of billions of people that are being dispossessed and exploited, right? while we still increase our capital and maintain our profiteering and keep the system kind of going the way that it is? Like, that's the question that isn't really being asked, but that's the premise of this video. And so I want to now keep that in mind and put it alongside our theory of change. And if we could bring the slides back up. So the reason that we, you know, organize and develop our own analysis is because if we just absorb things like this Bremer video and we think, oh yeah, wow, okay, he's talking about these really important problems, polycrisis, what is that? It's like we end up confused and essentially organized by the rich. But our model is the poor organizing the poor, which means we have to build our own analysis, our own understanding that helps us to achieve, what we're trying to achieve, not just kind of like listening to stuff that gets presented to us. Um, and so in our theory of change, right, we have an assessment of what is actually the fundamental problem. And that's the thing that's completely missing from this Bremer video. All of these things he's talking about are sort of manifestations of this fundamental problem of our time, right? Um, and so this fundamental problem of our time, as we understand it, is the growing concentration of wealth in a few hands while the majority is dispossessed, which gives rise over and over again to these four interlocking evils of systemic racism, militarism, poverty, and environmental destruction. And you see, right, those things, some of those things are referenced in the in the piece, but there's never an understanding of like what is the cause, right? Like what is underneath that. And then our theory of change goes into how we actually solve that problem. What is our perspective, right? That we need a massive, united social movement of clear and competent and committed and connected leaders, because we can't outmight them and we can't outmoney them, but we can outmaneuver them. But in order to outmaneuver them, we've got to learn, right? We've got to get wise and really understand what's happening, and develop leaders. And so this is what we talk about and think about throughout our work, is that everything we do to develop leaders. So I just wanted to contrast, and I want all of us to think about that, right? What is the usefulness of something like this very clear, straightforward theory of change, right? Versus this video that sort of talks around all of these things, but doesn't actually name the fundamental problem. But this is what we get inundated with, right? And so this is why we come together in Saturday schools to learn, right? To learn and to unlearn. So let's go to the next one. Thank you so much. Anita, I think you're doing the slides for us. Thank you so much. So in the Mishika, Willie made this reference because I had shared some of my story in that session, and he said, when you hear Nijmi's story, you're hearing political economy. And I had talked in that session about, my life, that I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania. I was raised by my grandparents. My grandfather was a steel worker. When I was a child, all the mills closed, and my family moved away from there. And then I lived in Philadelphia for 27 years. But my life was my whole life's journey, and I'm actually going to be 50 this year. And maybe one day I'll actually grow up. Not yet, but in any case, so my life is the story of this period of neoliberalism that we've lived through. And a lot of times people they take this back to like Reagan, and that's good, right? Like we should understand like what Ronald Reagan did. We should understand his policies, attacking workers, attacking unions, like changing the National Labor Relations Board. He did a lot of things. But oftentimes people just kind of keep it there and they don't then take through what are all the other pieces of context, right? That, continue to prop up the system, the economic system that we have that puts profit over people, also known as capitalism, the political system that's on top of that, that was a 50-year process of getting us to where we are today, the very, very difficult and the tenuous and the violent position that we are in here, right, in this country today. And they don't often talk about the things that happened under Democratic administrations, for example, right? This is why our position of political independence in the Nonviolent Medicaid Army is so important. Because if we want to have an accurate picture of reality, we've got to have the independence to look at what has actually happened, right? Not a nice story, not a simple little story that treats the parties like, football teams that we're either for this one or against this one, but a real story and an understanding of how did we get here. And so we see that, NAFTA happened under Clinton, which resulted in massive industrial job loss. Welfare reform also happened under Clinton, right? Which changed the social welfare state and the social safety net. The Telecommunications Act happened under Clinton, which led to the rise of media monopolies. Financial deregulation happened under Clinton, which led to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. The bailout of Wall Street at the expense of the working class happened under President Obama. The Affordable Care Act, which gave more people access to insurance, expanded Medicaid, and also preserved, expanded, and protected the private insurance system, right? Happened under President Obama. And all of these things, in addition to what happened under President Reagan, connect to this period where, and just to keep a quick definition of neoliberalism, it's this belief in the markets, deregulating markets, right? Less regulation, privatization, right? The kind of globalization, searching for the cheapest labor anywhere in the world. These are some of the hallmarks of this last 50-year period. So when folks wonder, like, how did we get here? This is a lot of what has brought us here. And these are political decisions that prop up an economic system, that keep an economic system going, right? To maximize profit, right? Within a system that puts profit over people. So we're going to watch another really brief clip here, and then I'm going to bring this section to a close and move into the next section that I have. So the next person we're going to look at is Rana Foroohar. So we're doing, again, some examination of kind of the ruling class strategists here. This is Rana Foroohar. Again, probably a lovely person. No criticism of her as an individual. But she is, a financial analyst, and she's been part of the CNN. She's been part of Financial Times. And she kind of, she makes an analysis that's useful. She's not somebody, she's still, I would still put her in this category of like a ruling class strategist, but she has this critique of neoliberalism, right? And she has a really interesting anecdote from the Clinton administration, and she's going to talk about conversations between labor, organized labor, the AFL-CIO during the Clinton administration with Clinton about globalization, right? And in jobs under globalization. So we can play this clip.
And I'll just share one of the anecdotes in the book, and I put it up front because I thought it really encapsulated what I was trying to get at. Was a conversation I had with Richard Trumka, who was the former AFL-CIO. Yeah, lovely man, really a lion of the American labor movement. He's passed now, but I had a conversation with him a few years back because I was trying to understand what was the conversation being had between labor and policymakers at the time of NAFTA, at the time of the movement of China into the WTO, which eventually happened in 2001. And I said, what did folks tell you? And he said he remembered a policymaker from the Clinton administration coming to him and saying, you look, we know this is going to kill you guys, but it's going to get better after time. The wages are going to leveling up, the whole notion of equalization of wages over time globally. And he said to the policymaker, well, okay, but how long is that going to take? And the policymaker said 3 to 5 generations. And that's the kind of thing that really, it's hard for people to not think, wow, I'm not a human being to you. I'm part of an algorithm.
Thank you. So, yeah, so do people see what she's saying? Do people see what happened there, right? That the Clinton administration told one of the, preeminent leaders of organized labor during the 90s that the labor movement was going to be decimated by this policy, and that things wouldn't even out or bounce back for 3 to 5 generations. And we can see that like that was that's a myth too. Like we're gonna talk about that, right? Because we're several generations down the line from that, and actually we're not going in a direction that goes back toward a massive ability for organized labor to function, right? That's not the direction that we're going in at all. Um, so I think that was just sort of a blow off, honestly. But I want you to think about this, and I think about it too, right? Every time I hear that uh, trope about when people say, "Oh, people voting against their own interests," I think of this clip, and that's why I try to share it over and over and over again, because I think of that trope, which we often hear, and I think about that in the context of this conversation. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we're going to get into the fact that, we're in an economic crisis. The crisis that is here and that is coming is the ruling class looks at this and they think back to the period of the 30s and other periods in history. And I think our analysis in the Nonviolent Medicaid Army is that this is different from the era of the New Deal, that the economic crisis of the Great Depression was resolved by a progressive section of capital, honestly, right? I mean, of course, there was massive upsurge and organizing, but ultimately a progressive section of capital stepped in to save the system from itself. And at this point in time, we don't believe that there's a progressive section of capital. There is no section of capital, right? Of owners of capital, of owners, of Wall Street. There's no section of Wall Street that's saying, stop the genocide and the war economy. We have to put that money toward human needs in order to save the system from itself. There's no section of capital that's saying, stop the attacks on Medicaid and SNAP. There's no section of capital that's taking a stand against the tripling of ICE funding. And we have to understand why that is and how this period is different. So when people start talking about going back and start talking about, oh, we need another New Deal, we don't believe that that's actually on the agenda or that it's even possible for capital in this time. So the last couple slides before I get into the economic crisis, and I'm gonna go as swiftly and carefully as possible. Um, just that there's an economic crisis that's beneath this political and social crisis, right? This graphic is from a piece of writing that I recently did, right? That what we're seeing, the most visible manifestations of this crisis right now, this political and social crisis, are ICE raids, these very brutal, vicious ICE raids and killings. Very visible and public and brutal, but at the same time, there's this fourth technological revolution underway and the rise of artificial intelligence that is fundamentally changing the economy as we know it. It's changing the basic premise of the US economy, which has been it's a consumer economy, and it's based on a relationship between workers and the owners of capital, right? And the rise of artificial intelligence is bringing about a sea change in that whole entire relationship. And that's something that we're not talking about and we're not really trained to focus on. And that change in the economy, that fundamental change in the economy, leaves the ruling class with no choice but to do what it's doing. While we're focused on these very visible manifestations that they keep right in our face, it's something that they've always been doing, right? The approach of divide and conquer, which is the cornerstone of their strategy. And that approach has been categorically throughout history and throughout United States history to target one section of the working class in order to control the whole class, to attempt to pit one section of the class against the other, another. And while this is happening, while these very visible manifestations and targeting of a section of our class are happening, there's a fundamental change happening in the economy right before our eyes. AI and data centers are building out, and those data centers and the rise of AI, which is leading already to structural unemployment. While through the kind of sleight of hand of what's going on with ICE, the detention and the surveillance infrastructure that is being built through that as part of this divide and conquer strategy is for all of us, right? It's part of a strategy to control and to move toward a more open and brazen need, right, for control, right? Less consent, less kind of, ruling class democracy, and more authoritarianism, right? In this context of deep economic structural crisis, through which the ruling class has very little means at hand to just control things the way that they have been for this last 50 years of neoliberalism. So we've got to connect, right? The folks who are saying, well, we've never seen anything like this before, to what's beneath that iceberg, to the people who are disengaged and people who are dealing with these things below the iceberg. We've got to make that connection and help people understand this fundamental problem at the root of both the things below and above the iceberg. So now I'm going to get into some things on the economic crisis, and I know my time is going a little over, but I'm just going to try for folks who are timekeeping me to do this by 1:55. So let's see if I can achieve that. So with that setup of like the how did we get here, right? And if you're engaged in the Nonviolent Medicaid Army in a state, which if you're not already, I hope you will be, or I hope you'll think about how you get started organizing with us. This Saturday school is an entry point into further discussion, further study, right? We're constantly studying. We have to teach as we fight and learn as we lead and walk as we talk. So this is not exhaustive today. This is a beginning, right, of this conversation. But we're going to look at some manifestations of this economic crisis and some of the causes of the economic crisis. And some of this comes from my dear friend, Chris Caruso. So I want to acknowledge his work. He's a popular educator, community organizer, and educational technologist, and he's been active in the movement to end poverty led by the poor for over 30 years. So I appreciate him letting me borrow some of the slides that you're going to see in this presentation. So first of all, there's massive job loss happening in this country right now. So nothing that I'm going to tell you here is going to be particularly rosy, right? Or, but we believe in the truth and we believe in looking at what is actually happening. And of course, as we unfold that and as we begin to really deep dive into our organizing, we'll see that there's actually tremendous opportunities for those of us who are building this movement to abolish poverty. So I'm not saying all this to you today to be like, everything's terrible, it's so bad. Like, it's bad, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But if we can develop ourselves as leaders and replicate ourselves as clear, competent, and committed and connected leaders, we will have incredible opportunities before us in our movement to abolish poverty. So what I want to say is that, this slide is just looking at the fact that in 2025, over 1,200,000 people were cut out of work. which is an increase of 58% from 2024. Annual job cuts are at the highest level since the height of the pandemic. So this graph just has these blue bars for every single year. It kind of shows the level of job cuts. And so we can see this crisis that is manifesting itself in just removing people from work, and many of those jobs also probably not coming back. This isn't just labor saving, this is labor replacing technology. So yeah, let's keep going. So we're going to look at a couple things on jobs first, and this just shows something about this in more detail with some of these major corporations and how many layoffs they have made in 2025 or 2026. So we see UPS, Amazon, Intel, Nissan, Nestle, Microsoft, Verizon, Bosch, Dell, and TOS or TCS. I'm not sure about the last one. And the numbers of cuts that they made, the layoffs that they made in 2025 and 2026. And it doesn't mean, right, we've seen that not all of this is because of AI right now, but AI has been being used as an excuse to do this, right? As a kind of rationale that, oh, okay, well, in the future, we're anticipating that we're not going to need these positions, so we're going to do it now. And so, unsurprisingly, on the left, we see the heading US workers get the smallest slice of the economic pie on record. So, on record, right? Like the working class in this country, despite the fact that our productivity is off the charts, despite the fact that an enormous amount of wealth is being created, and because of the fact that an enormous amount of wealth is being created in a system that concentrates that wealth in a very small number of hands, the working class has the smallest slice of the economic pie on record, the smallest share of the wealth on record. And on the right, we can see, right, that we have a system that is poverty in the midst of plenty, abandonment in the midst of abundance. And so you can't really talk about poverty. This is another mistake that gets made a lot. There's a lot of talk about poverty without talking about wealth. Talk about poverty, who's impacted by it, the disproportional impacts of it, and all those things, but we never talk about wealth because there can't be that pervasive poverty without this concentration of wealth. And so on the right, you see that the wealth of the top 12 billionaires has soared between just in the last 5 years. And it shows who they are. I'm not going to read all of it. We can definitely share these later. I'm just going to try to describe a little bit about what's on each slide. So the US has a consumer-based economy, right? What drives the US economy is consumption and spending. And what we see because of this crisis, because of what you just saw earlier, right, that workers have less and less to spend, is that right now, what's driving the consumer portion of the economy, which is the majority of the economy, is actually the top, 10% of folks in terms of, income. That's what's driving the economy. So high income Americans are behind roughly half of all US consumer spending, which means that if you're not making a lot of money, all of us here in this room today probably, right, are not really in this top 10% of earners in the country. We're not spending. And that's really rough news for an economy that is based on consumer spending. We're in debt, actually, right? Our situation is one of debt. And the economy is limping along with these two factors, right? Spending from the top 10% of incomes and this AI speculation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So here's another indicator of the crisis, inflation, right? So folks can share what it's been like buying food, making rent, paying for healthcare, paying for transportation, paying for education, right? All of those things. So on the left, you see, and you can put some of that in the chat. On the left, you see how that has impacted food prices. So eggs and coffee and sugar and beef. And inflation, another word for inflation is price gouging, right? This is price gouging. And then on the right, you see something that I think, again, as you go out and you organize and you shift the narrative and we stand up for our class, that again, because we're so pitted against each other, and you hear people saying, well, how can you be on welfare if you have an iPhone? How can you be on welfare if you have a TV? Well, look at the lines of what has gotten less expensive. You'll see TVs there on the bottom, and toys and computer software and cell phones, clothing. And then look at the top with all of the things that have been going through the roof. Hospital services, college tuition and fees, textbooks, childcare, medical care, right? So all of those things are increasing. And then there's some commodities, some items that go down in price. But that's a false narrative, right? That whole concept is a false narrative because everything that we need to live, all of our basic needs, which we consider to be our human rights, are getting more and more and more expensive. And here's other things that are getting expensive, right? Electricity prices, healthcare costs. And with that being said, since you went to the next slide, I'll just keep going. That's awesome. Another piece is debt, right? So how is the economy staying afloat at all when 90% of the working class can't afford to buy these goods, right? Because our wages are stagnant or they don't exist or we're being laid off. Well, the answer is debt, right? That's the system's way of kicking the can down the road, as Willie likes to say. And so this is a graph that shows outstanding credit card balances. And then if you go to the next one, you'll see that, look, that credit card now is that sort of red section of this graph. It's that little slice there. And actually, mortgage debt is the huge section of this. And then on top of that, you'll see automobile loans, student loans, credit card debt, and other debt. But household debt hits a record of $18.2 trillion in the first quarter of 2025. And finally, we'll get into artificial intelligence. So this is the fourth technological revolution that I mentioned earlier. And every time in our history, there are major changes in technology that drives the changes in how things are produced and how they're distributed, right? Who gets what, who makes it, who gets what, how, and why. And so that's what we are in now. We're at the beginning of this rise of artificial intelligence in the hands of the ruling class, right? In the hands of a very small group of billionaires. So we're not saying, oh, we're anti-technology. We don't want to see any technology of any kind. We're not saying that. But what we're saying is that these technologies have to be managed very thoughtfully and carefully. And the people who are running things right now, that's not what they're doing, right? And so this shows that the other thing that's propping up the economy is this speculation on AI, right? And so the Magnificent Seven on the left, they call them the Magnificent Seven because they are the companies that are at the cutting edge of this technology. We've got Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, which is the parent company of Google, Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, Microsoft, Nvidia, which makes chips, and Tesla. And so this is their market cap. This is like the whole basis of the stock market right now is these seven Magnificent Seven. And the graph on the right, which I'm not going to describe too deeply, but it basically shows the different kind of flows of the way that money is changing hands between these companies to kind of prop up their valuation and therefore the valuation of the stock market. But it actually isn't based on the actual value and the profit that they're making. It's just based on passing money around to make it appear as though, this is viable, when in fact, we're really looking at potentially a huge economic crisis and bubble through this AI technology right now. So it's kind of a shell game is basically what I'm saying, right? Like all of these people are sort of propping up the valuations of these companies that it's not really actually based on the real economy. And this is again, this for the first time, AI spending actually increased over consumption, added more to the GDP, the gross domestic product, than personal consumption. And again, the US is a consumer-based economy. So these just sort of show, um, and I think we know this, we can see this, that this is not something that is just impacting blue collar workers, right? I use air quotes in that. It's impacting workers across the board. Um, so we're all, right, like we say in the National Union of the Homeless, one paycheck, one healthcare crisis, one climate crisis, one housing crisis away from poverty. And AI is precipitating that for more and more people in society. And that means that folks are, the scales are kind of falling away from people's eyes, right? Folks are not believing this narrative that, you work hard and you just kind of have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and everything's going to be okay. That's always been false. But now more and more people are waking up to the reality that that is not true, which again presents these opportunities for organizing. So the crisis, again, there's sort of what Chris talks about as the proximate causes, which are these kind of short-term things that are happening that are having an impact on the economy for sure. Tariffs, immigration raids, the resegregation of the federal workforce, and just the general kind of uncertainty, right, from the political instability. But the fundamental causes are this chronic crisis of capitalism and labor replacing technology. And so finally, I'll just say that again, this is not a situation in which some progressive section of capital is going to emerge because the economy is really contracting. You can see the growth of the gross domestic product over the decades from the 50s to the 2000s. And we don't have the kind of expanding economy that we had, after that gave rise to the New Deal era, or that gave rise to the buildup of, the social safety net, or the period after World War II. We don't have that kind of expanding national economy. We have an economy that is contracting. So they're not really looking to throw us any kind of concessions moving forward. All right, so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark. I'm so sorry I went over time, Mark, to talk a bit about how we're meeting this moment.
Thank you so much, Nijmi. No worries at all. Please, folks, let's give some appreciation to Nijmi for that. There's a lot of stuff to talk through there, a lot of really complex ideas made especially difficult because that is not how the story is often given to us, right? We're given stories of AI driving technological booms, of innovation, of these growths in profit, which, as Nijmi just showed us, is really just 7 different companies passing money between each other while people can't afford homes and food and healthcare. So again, big props to Nishmita talking through all that. And what we're going to talk a little bit now is what this means for us and how this informs the way that we organize and respond to this crisis. Hey all, I'm Mark, use he, him pronouns. I'm in New York with the NVMA here. And I think part of why it's really important for us to understand this material, and part of why it's important to to take in the analysis that the ruling class is giving us, like in that initial video by Ian Bremmer, is to be able to understand that the solutions that they are offering are not real solutions, right? There is nothing that actually can solve this crisis that is going to come from the ruling class, because their solutions are only intended at managing the symptoms of that crisis without fundamentally changing the structures that create that crisis, because those structures are what keep them in power and keep them as a ruling class, and they are not motivated to change that. And so what we have to do is develop our own strategies in the face of that crisis. As Nijmi said, the cornerstone of their strategy, the cornerstone of the ruling class strategy, is to continue to divide us, right? To pitch portions of one part of the working class against the other, to put blame on one corner of the working class, to overly surveil and enact state violence against groups of people that will then be used to normalize violence against everyone else. And so if the cornerstone of their strategy is division, then the cornerstone of our strategy must be to unite the working class across all those lines of division, to cut through the narratives that are being fed to us, and to understand that the material conditions that we are facing are common to all of us in the working class as a result of the structure that we're living in and put upon by the ruling class. And we can even take some time, as I'm talking, folks are welcome to share in the chat how coming together in unity with other members of your class, coming together in unity with the NVMA, how that is helping you get through this crisis or helping you survive this crisis, because it is that unity that is bringing us together. Right? So folks are welcome to share some of that in the chat as you go along. And so we know that coming together and organizing as a unified working class is the only way that we can respond to and survive this crisis. And we do that by coming together, and we create that change, not from above. We cannot wait for a progressive section of the ruling class to save us. That change has to come from below. And we are doing that, as Nijmi says, because more and more people are losing confidence that what we have is working, right? We see it in our everyday lives, in our costs of our food, costs of our healthcare, costs of our housing. We can see that the system that exists is not working. And in fact, it is killing us, right? And so by coming together in unity across the entire working class, we can build a movement from below to change the system fundamentally, right? With the NVMA, with the Nonviolent Medicaid Army, we know that more than 70 million people are on Medicaid and millions more are excluded. That is a huge proportion of the 140 million that we talk about when we talk about the Poor People's Campaign as being this new and unsettling force. Right? These are the people with the most to gain and the least to lose from a fundamental transformation of society. So what we need to do is unite across those millions of people, across all those lines of division that are put in front of us, and fundamentally make a change in the structure of our society. I can go back to the slides for a second. I'll talk through some specific ways that we're doing that. Awesome, cool. Thank you so much, Anita. Again, thank you, Anita and Stacy on tech. So one way that we are building that unity is through our Medicaid's Cutoff Organizing Drive. So with this drive, where we are facing and confronting the murderous cuts to Medicaid that have started under the Biden administration and continue through the Trump administration, we are meeting people at the point of survival of the loss of healthcare and cutting across those lines of division to create this unified movement of the working class. And we're doing this in a couple ways to build support for folks, meet people and support our survival, and develop strategy together. So I'll talk through a couple specific ways we do that. We see them listed on the slide, and I'll go into a couple specific ones. You can go to the next slide. The core way that we are doing this is that we are, again, meeting people, our class, at the point of survival, and we are building permanently organized communities. We are doing this in 13 states across the country and ever building, and we are doing this through our work of deep and long-term base building, right? We're not just mobilizing people to come out to events and protests and actions, which are powerful in and of themselves. We are building communities together, learning together, and building our capacity for leadership in these permanently organized communities. And we are able to bring people in and do that by meeting folks at this specific point of survival of healthcare that unifies us across these lines of division. Go to the next slide. how do we meet those people, and where are we meeting folks at that point? As I said, we are able to unite across this point of survival, often through this work that we call projects of survival. One way that we do this is through things like people's clinics, where we provide kind of on-the-spot care to meet people's immediate survival needs, immediate medical needs, or things like food distribution, where we are providing food for folks who are unable to afford kind of such a basic necessity as food. And as we are doing that, as we are meeting those needs, we are also inviting people to share in this project, be part of this project of organizing for fundamental change, so that we don't need to be meeting our doctors on the street or getting food from a food distribution. We should have a system that is being able to provide those things. And we're meeting people at that point of survival, and at the same time, bringing them into a long-term, permanently organized community to be part of that movement for fundamental change. I can go ahead one more time. Great. At the same time, we are bringing the fight to the state as it exists currently. People are being cut off from their Medicaid, losing the access to basic needs such as healthcare and also food with these SNAP cutoffs. And we are teaching ourselves and educating ourselves about how to fight those cutoffs, right? How can we support our people in bringing their fight to the state, and actually have been very successful in reversing those outcomes? And so in providing that support, meeting folks at the point of survival, and together building those permanently organized communities, we are developing the unity of the working class that is the only way that we are going to be able to confront the current crisis that we are living in. And this is a crisis, just to note, this is a crisis that is not just affecting us here in the United States, but this is the same crisis that is affecting our entire working class globally, right? We see what is happening in Gaza and Palestine, we see what is happening in Venezuela, and these are the same structural forces that are affecting the working class around the world. And by unifying as a working class here, we can also work to unify across the world for fundamental structural change.